a delicate balance set up of all the different devices here. I think we'll be okay. Well, before we begin, any questions that you've been thinking of from last week, or anything that emerged in your minds? Anything? Yeah. We had a whole week. Yeah. Get some coffee then.
Yeah.
Get the mind going.
No, the one thing that hit me last week, and I've been pondering it all week, was when you were talking about the suffering and how that has nothing to do with the existence of God. It's the nature of God.
Right.
And that was profound for me, because that's what I struggle with right now, is the nature of God.
Yeah.
Not the existence. So that was really
okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Struck me.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, and it's something that really, yeah. I mean, I think about it a lot because, yeah, like I said in last class, my mom died or other bad things happened. You think like, oh, like it's frustrating. It makes you angry, but then you realize like, okay, but your faith can only sort of be affected like this far, and at a certain point, you're like, I can't not believe in God, or else I'm unwinding all my intellectual things as well, right? So yeah, it's a good sort of bulwark, as it were, to sort of the emotion, the tides of emotion.
Yeah.
For sure. Cool. Okay, so again, so thinking of last week, we were sort of mainly focused on showing that faith is rational, right? Because there's sort of a lot of things being thrown around in society about, faith is just, crazy or irrational. Strange objections I mentioned, like, so suffering being one of them, right? And really just trying to clear the ground and say, faith is rational. We can examine the universe and see what we, can learn about God. And so now that we've kind of, set the stage, as it were, cleared the kind of confusion and miscommunication, show that faith is rational, we are now going to rationally examine reality, rationally examine faith. And so the first thing we're going to do is basically look at our reality, look at our universe, and just see what we see, right? Because again, as I mentioned last class, we're going to build this class from the ground up. So we're not taking anything on assumption. We're just saying, let's look around. Let's see what we can conclude without using the Bible, without assuming God. And so one thing I wanted to note first before we do this is a key aspect of this is the volume of arguments that we're going to look at. And what I mean by this is if you can imagine going into a court of law. You go into a court of law and you're a lawyer and you say, okay, Your Honor, I have one piece of evidence. It's like a piece of scrap paper we found on the street, and that's my whole case. You might be in trouble, right? But if you go in and say, we've got DNA evidence, we've got surveillance footage, we've got eyewitness testimony, we've got GPS coordinates, we've got a paper trail, even if somehow one line of your case is sort of struck down or people don't buy it, you're still looking pretty good, right? Because you have all these other avenues of argumentation to make your case. And that's what we have here, right? So it's not that when we look at the arguments for the existence of God, it's, no one of them is like the silver bullet, here's the proof, you're done, this is all you need to know. Rather, it's the volume of them that makes the case strong. And so if you think, this is not like links in a chain, right? Links in a chain, if you break one, you've destroyed the whole chain. So you pick the weakest link and you're done, okay? That would be a very problematic form of argument. This is actually more like chainmail armor, if you can imagine, right? Every sort of chain, link in the chain reinforces the whole. And that's what we have here. There's so many arguments and they're all independent, right? So some people, may like the scientific one. Some people may like the philosophical one. Some people may like the mathematical ones, and on and on. But this is sort of like, you think of, Paul's advice in the New Testament. We become all things to all people that we might win some to Christ. We have so many arguments that you can kind of tailor it a bit to maybe who you're talking to, or maybe your own personal, sort of reflection. And it's the fact that these are all independent and strengthening each other that makes this really compelling, right? And so let's dive in. So the first one is we get 5 for the price of 1 here. And these are the 5 ways of Aquinas. So St. Thomas Aquinas was a Catholic theologian, I think around the 1200s or so. And he refined, oops, I think we lost power on there. Plug that in. He sort of refined some Greek thought, philosophical thought of Aristotle, if I have a Kindle here. I don't know. This is the church's laptop, not mine, so we might unfortunately be locked on that one. Okay.
Need a power cord for that?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what Aquinas was doing was he was refining some philosophical thought from some of the Greek philosophers, and also just trying to understand reality, right? And so again, he wasn't taking anything on assumption, but he was just looking around. And so what he started to think about was the first one, his first sort of argument. These are all kind of related, which is sort of why they're kind of grouped together. But this is the argument from motion. And what you want to join the class? Yeah. Argument from motion. And so what Aquinas was realizing was, some things are in motion and some things are at rest. But anything in motion does not, move of its own volition. Something moves it, right? And we have maybe even a more sophisticated scientific understanding these days, right? We have an understanding of like energy, right? So something in motion has kinetic energy. Something like lifted off the ground has what we call like potential energy. But we understand that like some things are in a state of energy, some things are not, right? You can imagine heat energy, right? A boiling cup of water has high heat energy, a cold cup of water doesn't. But in all these cases, whatever energizes something, it requires something else to transfer the energy, right? Something boils the water, something lifts something off the ground, something pushes something into motion. We'll do that in a second. Well, yeah, possibly, yeah. She's right here. Okay.
Come back.
Yeah. Okay.
I love that you need my technical support.
Well, it's your password.
Wow.
No, go ahead.
Nope.
You're utilizing some hacking efforts here. I thought I'd just let you do it.
I want you all to see that I can do this. Sorry, I'm gonna give that to you for a second.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because it's probably just church 1, 2, 3. Who just said that? You are officially out of my community group.
Not because you're wrong, but because you guessed it correctly. Yeah. Yeah. Can't go spreading the.
We have 10 exits out of the building. Which one would you like to use?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll take a second.
Sure.
You have to change your password.
Yeah.
So unkind.
Security breach. Yeah.
So unkind.
Okay, so I'm gonna keep going here. So, right, so something, right, energizes something else. Something pushes something. Something puts it in motion. But we can imagine now. Let's sort of think of how this would work over time, right? So we can sort of imagine maybe a steam engine. Okay, so all right, we have some, oil or gas or something we're burning. So that burns, and that, causes, thermal energy to enter the water. Okay, and then the water boils, and then the rising steam causes sort of this mechanical energy of this turbine, spinning. That turbine spinning causes sort of this electrical energy to, go into whatever sort of thing is powering. This is sort of how a steam engine works, roughly, right? But we see at each step along the way, something has sort of energized the next step. Okay, so that's sort of how a steam engine works. But we can imagine, like, that gas or oil, whatever it is we're burning, didn't just appear, right? That something gave that energy, and whatever gave that energy, sort of gave, that's the energy, and it goes back and back. Sort of imagine how this would work going back in time, right? Each step along this chain of sort of energy transfer. Well, if we keep going back and back and back, thank you.
Yeah.
What happens when we get to, like, we go back far enough, right? We go back far enough, either we actually find that there is no beginning. We just have gone back for an infinite amount of time, right? There is no kind of thing that begins this chain. Or we arrive at what Aquinas said, the first mover, right? The mover that started this whole chain of movement, right? Or he also called it the unmoved mover, right? Something that's able somehow to push the first domino, as it were, without itself being pushed. And he said, well, what kind of thing has this ability? What force exists that can move something without being moved? What is this unmoved mover? And Aquinas was often wants to say, he goes, this thing, whatever it is, this thing is what we call God, right? So now we have to be very careful. He didn't say, well, we all know that God can, move things without being moved, and so that's what did this, right? That he actually did it the other way around, right? He said, we've just examining reality, we've come to understand that this energy transfer requires either an infinite universe, which I'll get to in a second, or a first mover, right? An unmoved mover. So whatever that force is, needs a name, we call it God. Okay? Now, regarding the other possibility, the infinite universe, at the time, this is actually what people generally thought, that the universe was infinite. Because until sort of the 1950s, everyone believed the universe had no beginning. So actually, Aquinas was sort of going against sort of common scientific thought of the day in saying, no, there is no infinite universe, because he, being a Christian, believed that God created the universe. The typical scientific understanding of the day was that that was not true. And so some people rejected it on that basis. But this is another example of when I said science is reinforcing faith and reinforcing our understanding of God. Because of course, since Aquinas made this, we now know through science that the universe had the beginning. So we don't need this sort of other case anymore of Aquinas. We don't say, well, either there's a first mover or the universe is infinite. We know that's not true. So we require a first mover. And this thing, Aquinas said, we call God. Any questions about this one? Good, makes sense. So the next one is going to look somewhat similar, and it's the argument from causality. So if we think of our steam engine again, what causes that electricity to be produced? Well, the electricity production is caused by this turbine moving. The turbine moving is caused by the steam rising. The steam rising is caused by the water boiling. The water boiling is caused by combustion of whatever this fuel is, and that is that was given energy by something else, and the cause goes back and back and back and back again, until again either we trace this chain back, this causal link back through time, until either again we have an infinite universe because there is no beginning, or as Aquinas said, we've come to a first cause, or as he also said, the uncaused cause, right? Some force which is able to cause things to happen without itself being caused. And again, this thing we call God, right? So through these sort of two arguments, he's shown sort of two attributes of God, right? That God is able to sort of move things or cause energy transfer without himself sort of receiving energy. And God is able to cause things to happen without himself being caused, right? And so again, right, this is not, right, we have not mentioned any verse of the Bible. We've not assumed anything about God. We've just analyzed reality and understood how these things work, these physical attributes of our world, motion, energy, cause and effect. And we've come to understand some necessary principles and properties of our reality, that we require some force which does not follow the normal laws of physics. It is able to do things that otherwise in the laws of physics are impossible. And again, this thing we call God. Any questions about that one?
No, but you need to fix your PowerPoint so that it doesn't say
yeah.
argument from casualty.
Casualty, yeah, right.
Big difference.
Yeah. This is the first time we're using PowerPoint, so yeah, it might add refinements here. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Okay, next one is fairly similar again. So, I mean, in some sense, he probably could have boiled these down, but he, I don't know, liked having five, I guess. Argument from contingency. Now, if we remember our degrees of truth from last week, we might recognize this word contingent or contingency. So something, remember, is necessary if it's true or existent and could not have been otherwise. It must exist. It must be true. Something is contingent if it's true, if it exists, but it couldn't, or it's possible that it needn't have existed. And it came into existence at a point in time, and it probably will cease to exist at a point in time. Okay, so pretty much everything you can imagine is contingent. Okay, we're all contingent. This building is contingent, right? Because sure, we exist now, but there's a time when we didn't exist. There is a time when we will cease to exist, and we can all imagine a reality in which we didn't exist. Okay, so everything you can basically imagine is contingent. But now again, let's think about it. Okay, so I am here. I'm a contingent being. Well, why am I here? Well, my mom gave birth to me. Okay, but she was also a contingent being, right? Her mother gave birth to her. And now we can imagine something very similar, right? This status of contingency, we go back and back and back and back until we now, again, come to a point where we have an infinite universe, or there's a point in time when no contingent things have yet come into existence. And if there are no contingent things in existence, there is nothing to bring anything into existence, unless there is some force whose existence is not contingent at all, but is necessary. And so again, this force, right, is able to exist without being brought into existence. So this force is necessary. It has always existed. It must have existed. It couldn't not have existed. And this thing we call God, Aquinas said. Right? So again, they're very similar, but we sort of see different angles on sort of the attributes of God, right? Being able to sort of do things, create things, cause things, exist without being brought into existence. So these three are very similar. The next two are going to get a little bit different. So before we sort of shift gears a little bit, again, any sort of questions about how this all works? All right, I'll take one quick diversion and talk a little bit about why we know today that the universe is not infinite. And there's a couple different ways we know this in science. My favorite is called the heat death of the universe. Heat death of the universe. So there are plenty of arguments for the existence of God that don't require the universe to have a beginning. So even if we're unable to prove the universe had a beginning, we can still show that God exists. So we're going to see that with a number of other arguments. But it's kind of nice that we can show it because it just strengthens our argument. So this is one way that we know this. So in thermodynamics, branch of physics, there is a concept called entropy. You might have heard of it. Entropy, very roughly, is sort of the measure of randomness of particles in any system. Okay. And the second law of thermodynamics says that in nature, entropy always increases. So whenever any chemical reaction happens, entropy will increase. So things get more and more chaotic, right? And this kind of maybe makes some sense to us. Like we understand, like, things tend to get messy. We require energy to put them back into order, right? That's sort of how things typically work. So that's also true in nature. And so this is the only thing in nature that sort of has this directed or temporal, time-based property, that over time, something changes. You think of, again, boiling water for the steam engine, right? If water boils, you can condense it, and it boils and condenses and boils, and it's just purely reversible. And if I somehow were sort of able to give you like a snapshot of the molecular state of the water in both, liquid and gas, you wouldn't know whether it was water that was boiled or, water vapor, gas that was condensed. You have no way of knowing, except for entropy, because you can see if the entropy is higher or lower in whichever one, okay? Now, here's the thing. Because of this time-based property, well, that means that over time, the entropy of the universe is increasing. And if the universe were infinite in time, right, had no sort of time-based beginning, it was always here, then now we would have an infinite amount of entropy in the world, in the universe. And what that would mean is things are so randomized, so chaotic, there's not enough energy in the universe to do anything, right? Because entropy has reached its maximum point. Well, that's not our universe, right? We're still doing things, right? The stars are still burning. We still are existing. We can still do, things. We can build things and make things and energize things. So entropy is not at its maximum, quantity. Well, then the universe can't be infinite then. It must have had a beginning. And so that's the conclusion. That's called, this sort of, otherwise it would, if the heat death of the universe implies you're at a point where entropy, because it's so maximized, there's no useful sort of heat or energy left in the universe to do anything. And because we're not in that state, we conclude the universe had a beginning. Any questions about that one? I wasn't too deep into the weeds of thermodynamics there. But anyway, long story short, this is one of the ways we know that the universe had a beginning, right? So again, not necessary to show the existence of God, but helpful. Okay, so now we're going to go a little more philosophical. And so this is the argument from degrees of quality. And so what Aquinas realized was that, if you think of the nature of life, or really anything, but he's going to look at the nature of life, he said, it's better to be alive than dead or inanimate, right? So rock is not a great quality of life. Better to be a plant than a rock, let's say, okay? Better to be an animal than a plant. Better to be a human than an animal. And he said, okay, well, we're able to order these things according to how good they are, right? And he said, well, the only way you can have this kind of ordering, understanding, is if there is some standard by which you are evaluating them against, right? Otherwise, you can't order anything without some standard. And he said, okay, so if we're able to order this, there must then be some highest good. And that's how we can compare and how we can order these things, by comparing them to the highest good. And so he said, if there must be some highest good, some greatest good, purest good, some standard by which all goodness is evaluated, this thing we call God, right? Now, some people don't like this because they will dispute the ordering. Some people these days, for example, will say, well, it's better to be dead than alive. And they sue their parents for giving birth to them, right? Or I've had people say to me, some like very strict vegans say, it's better to be an animal than a human. Animal rights are more important than human rights. And so they dismiss it. But actually, see what they've done. They haven't said there's no ordering. They've just said you've got your ordering a little bit wrong, right? Animals are above humans, or dead are above living, okay? But they're still saying there is an order. So again, how are they making that ordering? Well, it must be because there's a standard. And if there is a standard, a highest good, this thing we call God, right? So again, Aquinas is not saying we know God is good and therefore he's a standard. He's saying we look around, we have an understanding that we order things by this goodness. And so therefore there must be a standard. So this thing we call God. And he's sort of arrived at the fourth quality of God here. Any questions about that one? Good. Okay, we'll go to the final one here, argument from directedness. And so again, what Aquinas was doing is he's looking around the world and he said, things in nature seem to be directed towards some end. You plant a tomato seed, it becomes a tomato. It never becomes an oak tree. It never becomes a whale, right? It always becomes a tomato plant. Well, why? Who has directed it toward that end? The seed didn't direct itself, presumably. Something has directed it. And this was something that the Greek philosophers, again, like Aristotle, thought about a lot. And they had a word for it in Greek called telos. Okay? And the telos of something was its ultimate end, the end that it was sort of inexorably being directed towards, right? Its final form. And an old branch of sort of thinking around it called teleology. Okay. This idea that, yes, everything was directed towards, its ultimate end. And something had given it that direction, that it did not direct itself. Now, from what we know these days of genetics and biology, we may think, well, this is very strange. This is really weird, because we all know that, like, it's your, genetic material that decides, what form you're in and this and that. And it's, the characteristics gained from your parents and it's passed on. Okay, and that's what gives it direction, not, some external force. And I would almost agree, except that in evolutionary biology, they kept running into this problem where things seemed directed in ways they couldn't explain by genetics. And they were using language that sounded a lot like teleology. And they didn't like it because it kind of implies God, right? That some director is directing everything, right? Giving it purpose and an end state. They didn't like it. So what they did was they made their own word. And they call it teleonomy. Right? So evolutionary biologists still basically believe that species and populations behave in directed ways. They just call it teleonomy and avoid these sort of historical baggage of teleology, which sort of sounds historically like it was implying God. They picked their own word. So if it wasn't for the fact that evolutionary biologists felt they needed to just come up with a word because they didn't like the old word, I would agree. Maybe this one doesn't make sense anymore. We'll call it the 4 ways of Aquinas from now on. And yet they just kept coming against it. And they didn't like it, and they didn't know what to do with it because they couldn't explain it scientifically. So they just made their own word and closed the book on that one. But obviously it's not really a solution, right? So I'm not a biologist, So you can maybe take that with a grain of salt. But the point, of course, being, again, with the volume of arguments, that, this is not meant to be a silver bullet argument for directedness. It's just another kind of link in our chainmail armor to go, yeah, that's interesting. Why did they feel they had to get away from that word, and why did they make their own one? Curious. And maybe that, means something to you, and maybe it doesn't. But luckily, we have so many other arguments that, maybe it affects you, maybe it doesn't. But the point is, I think the volume of them is what matters. So, yeah, another sort of angle on God that Aquinas came to. Any thoughts about any of these then before I erase it? Good.
What year was he coming up with all these ideas?
I believe this was around the year 1200. Yeah, so a while back. And again, this is sort of what I was mentioning, or I think I mentioned, but not I'll mention now. Again, thinking of this idea of like science advancing, right? In the years, again, like 50 AD, right? No one had said this. I mean, some of this was already kind of happening with the Greek philosophers, but in some sense, a lot of these didn't exist, and the ones we're going to see too, right? It's now that we have the advantage of all this, millennia of scientific thought, of philosophical thought, right? And so, these ones are, again, fairly old. And so one thing we'll have to see as well is, most of the ones we're going to look at are fairly old. Some are quite recent. But one thing I wonder is, for any skeptic who thinks there are no arguments for the existence of God, which I think is actually the popular common belief, right? Maybe even among some Christians, that we just have faith, we don't have reason. Okay. I wonder, to the skeptic, what research are they doing that they can't find? Like, this wasn't invented yesterday, right? This is 800 years ago. So again, not trying to drag it into the mud, but I feel like maybe they aren't really doing real research here, because they would find these, which again are quite old. They've sort of stood the test of time. And I've presented these, to atheists and friends of mine, and they don't even really debate it, because how can you dismiss it, right? And so what some of them said to me is like, well, I don't have an answer for this in physics, but I have faith that we'll find it. Right? Again, it's that scientism I mentioned last week, right? Because I don't have the answers, but I have faith that science will provide us with the answers. Okay. So yeah, I found these, fairly compelling, even for the skeptics, because there's not a lot to debate. This isn't a very complex thing, right? There's a little bit of nuance, but tracing cause and effect back through time is not that complex. But again, then you have to explain, well, why did they just dismiss it then, right? Okay, so that's the 5 ways of Aquinas. Let's go to the Kalam cosmological argument. This one also is quite old. It's first developed by Islamic scholars, actually. So it's Kalam, which is sort of an Arabic word. If you're familiar with the Christian philosopher and apologist Dr. William Lane Craig, this is his favorite argument for the existence of God. And it's very, very simple, actually. Cosmological argument. There are 2 premises and 1 conclusion. That's what I have on screen here. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. I guess it's not a huge point in me writing this out, it's already here, but oh well. Begins to exist has a cause. And I'm going to underline begins to exist, because it's going to be important in a second. Universe began to exist and conclusion, the universe has a cause. Now, if we remember the propositional logic that I mentioned last week, we can show this in propositional logic. It's fairly simple. This one is, so, premise 1 would be, if cause, or sorry, if exists, then cause, exists, universe at least, therefore cause. Right? So, it's simple as you can get, right? And so this is often called a syllogism. You may have heard that word, syllogism, sort of in logic and philosophy, which is basically means you have one sort of major premise, so it's sort of talking about, things kind of setting up, one minor premise, which is usually like a specific instance of it, and then a conclusion. So again, you can't really get logic simpler than this, okay? But let's examine. And what we can maybe see, first of all, is that, again, the logic is what we call valid. I mean, there's no errors in logic. So if it exists, then there's a cause, and it doesn't exist, therefore a cause. Okay. So it's valid logic. We now have to see if the logic is sound, which means is it true? Okay. Well, let's see. Where do people debate this and deny this? Okay, because again, it's very simple. They have to basically dispute one or both of these two. Well, the universe began to exist. Again, no one really disputes this anymore, right? I mentioned the heat death of the universe. We have sort of other examples as well in science. So this one is not really disputed. So now there's only one left. So people have to debate this one. So how do they do it? Well, one way they do it is by either from ignorance or maliciousness, they just misstate it. So for example, you may have been familiar with a book called The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, premised chiefly on just misstating this premise. Because what he says, Christians say, is everything that exists has a cause. And he says, well, then what caused God? And he wrote a book about it, and he thinks it's brilliant, as if no one in 2,000 years or more has ever thought of this, kind of kindergarten level idea. But of course, we don't say everything that exists has a cause. We say everything that begins to exist has a cause. And we remember from the 5 ways of Aquinas that we actually require some being, some force, right, whose existence does not begin, right, that always exists. So God is excluded from this, an analysis here. God is not a type of being that this applies to. Okay, so that objection is out. Another thing, some people will say is, well, sure, the universe has a cause. It caused itself. Right? Now, first of all, this has no sort of understanding or explanation in any logic or science. What would that mean? Cause itself? Like, there's nothing we can point to, again, in science or logic that would have any explanation of what that would mean, right? But they say, yeah, it has a cause. It caused itself. It's some sort of this weird cyclical kind of whatever. Now, what they may counter with, though, is, well, in quantum mechanics, stuff pops into existence all the time, and that's no problem, right? But again, so as I may have mentioned last class, or not, I mentioned now. Again, so Richard Dawkins is very fond of saying that Christians believe in a God of the gaps, and what he means is that we only believe in God because there are gaps in our scientific knowledge, and as those gaps shrink, the space for God shrinks. So we think God causes thunder. Once we realize that gap shrinks, and we realize, okay, God doesn't cause thunder. And as we shrink all the gaps with science, there's no more room for God. So the only reason we believe in God is because of these gaps. But I think the objection to this is again, so the science of the gaps. Well, we don't know, what caused it. So quantum mechanics, magic, essentially, right? Magic under the guise of physics. And there's even a scientist named Lawrence Krauss. And when he talks about this, he'll say, well, yes, the universe, came out of nothing. And you ask him, well, it's like, what do you mean? What is nothing? Oh, nothing is a roiling sea of energy and quantum possibility. Well, that's not nothing then. That's a roiling sea of energy and quantum possibility, right? But the problem is there's where do you insert an argument here? It's so simple. You basically have to start redefining words, misstating premises, or there's just nowhere for them to sort of hang their hat to deny this, right? If you're at all interested in sort of, just another example, when over Christmas, I went to visit my in-laws, and my brother-in-law is very, let's say, passionate about his atheism. Let's say it nicely. And, we're sort of talking about this kind of stuff and having a discussion. And he said that, well, the universe was created by a, multidimensional, non-physical quantum multiverse. And, I like to say, a rose by any other name smells as sweet. You say multidimensional, non-physical quantum multiverse, and as Aquinas would say, and this thing we call God. Okay. So, but you see, it's this appeal to essentially science that we have no evidence of, which is essentially just magic, right? There's no evidence of this, quantum multiverse. But they don't want to believe in God, so they say, well, it's a quantum multiverse. And because it sort of sounds scientific in a way, that they've just found their excuse. Let me get there. There's a book, a very interesting book, written by, so if you know Stephen Hawking, he often had a research partner, Sir Roger Penrose. And let me see if I can get the name of the book here. So he's one of the most well-known astrophysicist of the day, right? Like, here we go. Oh, here we go. Okay. So he wrote a book. It's called Fashion, Faith, and Fantasy in the New Physics of the Universe. So he is not a Christian, okay? Physics of the universe. But what he was noticing was the way people were talking about the cosmology, the beginning of the universe, sounded to him essentially like this sort of cult-like magical mysteries, right? Not science. And he said, like, it's absolute nonsense. And again, Stephen Hawking, who they work together, so they have a good rapport. Stephen Hawking wrote a book, I believe it was called The Grand Design, and in it, one thing he said was, because there is such a thing as the law of gravity, the universe can and will, like as in inexorably, create itself out of nothing. That's what Stephen Hawking wrote in the book. Now, again, first of all, if there's nothing, then there's no law of gravity, right? So again, it's refuted right on the face. But what Roger Penrose said in this book was this whole idea, right, you possibly may have heard like string theory and M theory as a variant of that, and they to get the math to work out, they require 11 dimensions of space-time to actually get everything to work out. Okay. And what Roger Penrose said is this is all nonsense. There's no evidence of this. There's no way to even run an experiment, right? Like the scientific method, ostensibly, is all about running experiments, testing things, seeing if you make a hypothesis and it matches what you thought. What he said was, you can't. There's no experiment you can even run. There's no evidence of this at all. So people need to stop using this as like a explanation for how the universe began. So again, if you're interested in, again, not a Christian, but yeah, very highly regarded astrophysicist, you can read that book. So the point being, right, we have a very, very simple argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, which we all know. We don't doubt it. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And we see that the best arguments to debate this very, very simple argument make no sense, right? They're, again, just from a redefinition of the word nothing, a misstating of the premise, an appeal to magic, right? There really is no argument that people have made to debate this. And again, so old arguments like Aquinas that get stronger as science advances. This is still getting stronger every day as more science is done. Any questions about the Kalam cosmological argument? Good. So again, we sort of see another thing here. So the universe, right, needed to begin at a certain point in time. And so then we sort of now have to ask, well, okay, well, how did it begin? Right, that's sort of the question I mentioned last time. How did the universe begin? And one thing we can look at first is, okay, if you don't think God created the universe, then it must just be some force, right? Like my brother-in-law's metaphysical, magical, quantum force, okay? Skip that one for now. So I sort of have been coming up with this on my own. It has no fun name, like the Kalam cosmological argument. I call it the nature of forces. And so let's think about this for a second. If someone makes the argument that, okay, yeah, fine, the universe came to exist, but it wasn't God, it was just some force. Well, we have to ask, well, what kind of properties would this force have? Because, when we think of forces, we understand that, obviously they're mindless, right? Forces can't choose anything. And there's something that we say about how forces work. We say when the conditions are sufficient for a force to act, sufficient for its force to act, it will act, or it is necessary that it will act, okay? So let's think about this for a second. Necessary that it will act. So conditions are sufficient, it is necessary that it will act. What does this mean? Okay. If I hold this pen in the air and I let go, it will drop. It can't not drop. It can't wait around until it decides maybe it'll drop. It can't go upwards instead. It can't even change the speed at which it drops, right? Everything is completely deterministic, right? The behavior of this pen dropping is completely deterministic. When the conditions are sufficient, as in I let go, it is necessary the force will act instantly. It cannot wait. It cannot choose how it behaves. Another example, right? You have a bandsaw whirring and you push some wood up to the saw. When you push the wood up against the saw, it is cut. It cannot not be cut. It cannot be cut in a way that the saw decides, I'm going to design it like this now, right? It is cut. End. Okay, so people are saying that a force, right, created the universe, not God. Well, this force then is able to produce a universe out of nothing. So why did it wait to a moment in time? As you said, the universe had a beginning. If the force is infinite, it should have made a universe that's infinite, right? Because the force is timeless. It had the capacity to make the universe. The conditions were sufficient. Conditions being like nothing, right? Because it can make the universe out of nothing. So if a mindless force was responsible for creating the universe should be infinite. Because the force is infinite in time, had no beginning, right? So, well, we don't see that. The universe is not infinite. The universe began at a moment in time, which means this mindless force waited around, and said, now is a good time. Now I will make the universe. That's not how forces act. That's how people act, right? That's how minds act. A will that says, now I will make it. Think of it a different way too. You know, we live in a universe where the planet Mars exists. Now, could it have been that Mars didn't exist? I don't see why not, right? But actually, if a mindless force made the universe, Mars is necessary to exist. Because the universe, or this force, cannot choose what universe to produce. It will deterministically produce the universe. Just like the pen cannot choose how it drops, the wood cannot choose how it's cut, okay? The force will just make whatever universe it's capable of making deterministically. So what we're saying then is, the existence of Mars, the existence of us, this world, everything is deterministic, right? Mars couldn't have not existed. We could not have not existed. Everything is exactly as the only way it could have been. And there's no possible way the universe could ever have existed in any other way. But again, if you ask someone, is Mars necessary for our universe to exist? They probably will say no. But then they have to answer how it could be that a mindless force decided to either make Mars or not make Mars, right? And there is no answer because this is not how forces behave. This is how beings with will behave. Any questions about this? So what I think this shows is that whatever this force is that made the universe, it's not mindless. It had a will, and it could make a choice that now I will make the universe. So again, we've gained a new attribute of God, right? God can move things without being moved, create things without being created, exist without having to be brought into existence, and created the universe at a moment in time. I mean, we're getting a lot of stuff here, for what this God is. And again, we haven't looked at the Bible. We haven't, done anything by blind faith. We're just analyzing our reality and coming to some pretty profound conclusions, I think. Okay, so I'm going to go back one slide. Now talk about, okay, let's think about this universe that was made. Well, we've come to understand, and so this is one of the more recent discoveries in science that support faith. The universe is incredibly, amazingly, delicately fine-tuned. Universe. And so, for example, there are around 22 or so fundamental quantities of the universe. Okay. The only reason I say "or so" is because some say, some are. There's just some debate about which ones are like fundamental, which ones are derived. So, what are some examples? For example, the strong nuclear force, on molecules. The weak nuclear force. weight of an electron. There's all these things that if any one of them was the tiniest, slightest bit different, there would be no universe. The universe would be incapable of supporting possibly life or possibly like physical coherence at all, meaning the universe would sort of be created and then instantly collapse into nothingness. It's, unable to sustain itself. And it's not even just that the values are delicately tuned; they're delicately balanced, amongst each other, right? So it's not even just that like it, somehow found the right number to be. It's that it's the right number in relation to all these other forces. Now this is very, very strange for a couple of reasons, right? So number one, the odds of the weight of an electron being what it precisely is like ludicrously minute. Like why would it be that exact weight? Nature, right, has a way of finding equilibrium that sort of is the simplest it can be and no simpler, right? So, for example, if you are standing on a hill and you drop a ball, it's going to kind of bounce, so it finds a groove and then roll down, right? It's found the path of least resistance, right? The makeup of molecules and atoms is all about this, right? The electrons sort of, form around the atom in the way that takes the least amount of energy, right? It found the most stable, path of least resistance to exist, okay? It doesn't require any excess energy to hold this state. So the point being, if it were possible that the universe could have existed in a simpler form, right? So, okay, we're in this very fine-tuned universe, but there, actually, we just got lucky. It could have existed much simpler. If the universe could have existed in a simpler form, why doesn't it? Right? Because everything in nature does this. It finds this equilibrium of sort of the simplest form, but no simpler. So if it were possible for the universe to exist in a simpler form that wasn't so delicately fine-tuned, we would expect to see that. We don't expect to see unnecessary complexity in nature. So this is very, very strange. And now here's an interesting thing. No scientist debates that this is true, that everything is delicately fine-tuned. They don't debate that. They know it's true. That any tiny change in any of these quantities, the universe would be rendered, inhabitable or non-existent. They don't deny that. But now the question then is, okay, so how did it get fine-tuned, right? And so some of them will say, well, it was just random chance. We just got lucky. But again, right? So okay, if you take a dice and you roll it, what are the odds of getting a 6? 1 in 6. Okay, right. Yeah. No. Now, if you roll that dice 1,000 times, you get 6 every time. The odds of that are impossibly low. And would you think, got lucky? Or would you think this dice is rigged? It's all 6s, or someone is, messing with it, right? That's what you think. It's rigged. Now, the odds of rolling a dice, getting a 6 1,000 times in a row is way more likely than any one of these being, the value it is, let alone balanced amongst all the values. Like the chance of this happening randomly is so astronomically low, it's not even like comprehensible. It's 0.0001 out of trillion zeros. Like it's so low. But to say it was just chance is bizarre. And another thing I'll say is, in my experience, again, right, you don't really find, you don't find mathematicians appealing to chance, right? You find people who are not sort of, as strong in math appealing to this, because for them it's sort of this out. But mathematicians don't believe this is how things work, okay? And again, let's think about this. If we have a force, okay, so our force is making the universe, it's mindless, making the universe. Okay, remember, the chances are low. Okay, so it made the universe, that didn't work, collapses, we'll try again. But wait a minute, why does it know to try new values, right? The conditions are the same they were before, there's nothing. So when the conditions are exactly the same, the force has no mind, it doesn't know how to try new values, it will make the same universe, not a different one. And then the universe will collapse. And it'll try this process again for an infinite amount of time. It'll never produce a valuable universe. So the idea that just over enough time, this force will just get lucky makes no sense. Because the force is not able to try new values. And once the universe collapses, the conditions are the same again, right? And forces act deterministically, right? The saw cuts the wood the same. The force creates the universe the same if it's mindless. So time is not an answer here, right? So that must mean then that we got the right universe, this force made it on the first try, okay? Which again is so mind-numbingly bizarre, but still people will try to cling to this, okay? And so there's something I'll put down here called the anthropic principle. Anthropic principle. And what this says is basically, well, sure, the odds of the universe existing are very low, but if it didn't work out, then we wouldn't be here to comment on the low chances. And so it's obvious that it just worked out because we got lucky. Because if it wasn't lucky, we wouldn't be here to talk about how it's very unlikely. Okay, which is kind of bizarrely circular, but is sort of one of the best sort of defenses, if you will, against sort of this idea. And I mean, it does make some degree of sense. Yes, if the universe didn't exist, we would not be here talking about the universe. That's true, but in no other context do we contemplate the existence of something explaining its own existence, right? So, for example, let's say that today you won the lottery, only you didn't buy a ticket. You wouldn't just be like, well, it's obvious I won the lottery. If I didn't win the lottery, we wouldn't be talking about how I won the lottery. No, you would say, what is the reason this very improbable event took place, right? The fact that it happened does not explain itself. So we don't apply this anthropic principle to anything else. This is the only thing people, apply it to. And again, Richard Dawkins, he says, well, sure, we know the universe appears to be fine-tuned, but we know it's not, so we just dismiss that, right? Again, no argument made. We just dismiss it. It's because he has no defense. All the scientists know it's fine-tuned, but he just doesn't like it. So he says, but we know it's not, so that's it, right? Which again is not an argument at all. It's just disliking the conclusion and just, not thinking about it, okay? So again, this is, one of the more modern examples of how we have come to understand the need for God because of science, right? This is all science, right? All, physics and mathematics. And again, this is sort of 1930s and onward that are sort of coming to understand this. So again, we've sort of gained now a very interesting property of God, because not only now does God have the will to make the universe, well, it sure seems like he's got the intelligence to pick the right one. So that's now very interesting, right? Any questions about the fine-tuning of the universe?
I have a question about the universe.
Yes.
Not to look stupid, I don't care.
No, that's right. No.
The universe is the one, but are we talking about a finite universe or an infinite universe?
Infinite in what dimension?
In my head, like I mean, when I think universe, I think of a never ending. I can accept a beginning, but no end. But I also get, because I bring in multiverse as a marvel.
Sure.
So I just don't, what is the definition of universe?
Okay. Right. So one important thing you need to clarify is when you say infinite, you say, in what dimension? Is it infinite in time? Is it infinite in space, like volume? Because these are different things, right?
Right. Okay.
And so that is a part of it. So we say, the universe is really weird because we say the universe essentially is infinite in volume, except that it's also expanding, which is a strange thing to think about, right? Like, so, but fine, okay, we say it's sort of infinite in volume in some sense. And it may be infinite in the future, but still it had a beginning, and that's the important part. It has a beginning, even if somehow it existed, for all eternity future. It still had a beginning, and that's kind of the point that we're really focused on. Does that clarify anything? I guess I didn't talk about the multiverse yet, but
no, that does.
Okay.
I think for me, universe is in space.
Yeah.
Not time.
Right.
I can put that aside,
Mhm.
but it's just the spatial. That
Yeah.
It's out there. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions about this one? Good. Okay. On to the next one. We'll do that one. Right at the end.
One quick question.
Yeah.
So the universe is expanding. What's it expanding into?
Yeah, okay, so this is a very good question, and this is a question I asked my grade 9 science teacher. He had no answer for me. But okay, this is the best analogy that I've ever seen. Okay, you can imagine this room. And this room, okay, it has a sort of set dimension. Here's the walls, okay. Now imagine everything in the room was shrinking. Well, the relative space in this room just got a lot bigger, but the room didn't get bigger. But somehow, like, the usable space actually became a lot bigger because everything just shrunk. The distances between everything increased. The space that everything took up increased, or it decreased, right? But the dimensions of the room didn't actually change. So this, I think, is probably the best analogy. It's not so much that it's expanding outward, it's that somehow, in ways that it doesn't really make much sense, but if you can imagine the analogy, everything is sort of just shrinking relative to the universe somehow. And that at least, I think, solves the conundrum of, what is it expanding into, which I don't know, doesn't really have any answer. Now, it's a little bit weird because we don't really conceive ourselves as shrinking, but I mean, in some sense, we kind of are in a galactic sense because things are kind of spreading out. So, I mean, again, are we spreading out? Are we sort of shrinking in some sort of physical way we can't really understand? Maybe. But does that kind of answer your question a little bit?
Kind of. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's a bit of an open question. There's not really a very strong understanding of that, I'd say. But we know it because of, for example, like there's something called like sort of the red shift, which if you look at light, you can see that things are moving away. You can sort of see that, by analyzing the light coming towards Earth. So we can see that, things are all moving away. So then, that's how they determined it. But yeah, it's a bit not fully understood. I might not have the last slide here. I think we're going to talk about morality. Yeah. Okay, yeah, we're going to switch gears a little bit from this understanding of physical universe and look at something a little more philosophical. This is the argument for morality. So for anyone who needs a palate cleanser after sort of the physics and science, this one will maybe be a nice argument from morality. Okay, so again, our sort of syllogistic structure, our syllogism, this would look like this. If absolute morality exists, then there is a God. Then there is God. Number 2, absolute morality does exist. Does exist. Conclusion, there is a God. So this is actually very similar, right, in the logical structure to the Kalam cosmological argument. So, if morality exists, then there's a God, morality, God, right? So very similar. But now we're looking at this idea of morality. So again, if someone's going to deny this, they must show where we've made an error in one of these two, right? Because again, the logic is valid. Now, the thing that I've witnessed is that most people will actually agree with one of these, okay? So for example, the very strict naturalist who believes that, the natural world is all there is, will often actually believe this one, right? Because they think, well, absolute morality doesn't exist because how could absolute morality emerge by purely naturalist means, right? They don't see how it could. So they say, fine, if somehow that were true, then there'd be a God, but they don't believe it exists anyway. So it's moot, right? But they believe this one. On the flip side, you'll have people who maybe they believe very strongly in sort of, social justice and social issues, and they will believe absolute morality exists. They feel it very strongly. But now they've got a bit of a problem because they can't believe this premise, because if they believe this one, then again, the conclusion follows purely logically. So if someone does believe in absolute morality, they're forced to deny this one, that somehow their absolute morality has emerged, essentially, without God. So let's think about this a little bit. So as I mentioned last week, I'm a video game developer, and I make worlds and peoples and AI, right? So intelligence. Now let's imagine, okay, so I made a game on my computer, and then, okay, I'm done with that computer. I put it in my basement, I forget to turn it off, let's say. And over time, there's dust and weird things get into the hard drive. And over time, it actually makes itself a game. A game has emerged from this, purely deterministic process of my, the little dust in the machine in the basement. And you may say to me, that's bizarre. How could that ever happen? And I say, well, that's not even the full story. Can you believe it? Absolute morality has emerged in this game. And you would think, what does that even mean, right? Because if it's absolute morality, that means that the morality of that game applies to us. And the morality of that game applied before it ever came to exist. And if I go unplug that computer, that morality still applies because it's absolute. Now, here's the thing. I think people don't understand when they, kind of like last week, we were looking at the idea of truth and absolute truth and relative truth, what that means. When they say absolute morality, I don't think they understand what they're saying. Because absolute morality is morality unbound by time, right? Because we have a word for morality that's good at this point in time. We call that a law, right? We have a word for that already, right? It's ways we should behave at this point in time, in this place, that seem good to us, okay? That's not absolute morality. That's just a social norm. That's a law, okay? If absolute morality exists, then it exists irrespective of what time period you're living in and what place you're living in, right? So the morality of Canada in 2022 is the same as the morality in China in 2022, and in ancient Egypt in the year 4000 BC. Okay, that morality is the same. If that's what it means by absolute morality, as opposed to just a norm or a cultural convention or a law. Okay, but now again, let's think of the example. Okay, so the absolute morality coming in my game is just absurd. Like, what would that even mean? Somehow this morality applied before it ever existed. It applies to us outside of it. Okay? But now this is actually the exact case that they do believe just about our world, right? That, somehow the universe was created not by God, right? By some force, and created, this absolute morality emerged when the Big Bang spewed forth particles. Morality came, right? And, it's not that, because again, absolute morality, right? So that morality applies equally to us here in 2022 in this room, as it applies to, the aliens on Glaxon 7 and some far-flung, galaxy, right? Because it's absolute morality that emerged when the universe was birthed, as it were, okay? It's not a law on Earth.
Can you define absolute morality? Like, when you're saying,
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Right. So essentially is if something, again, it's a little bit circular maybe, but it's something that is right or wrong, and the determination of that is not bound by time or place. Right? So it is right or wrong, irrespective of what age you live in, what place you live in, what planet you live on, what year you live in. It's right or wrong, separate from all those cultural, and space and time factors. Does that explain a little bit? Okay. Now, and let's think about this even further. So someone who says there is absolute morality, but and the implication being like we know it, right? We know what absolute morality is, and there's no God. That means that basically everyone that lived before us that had a different idea, well, they're all barbarians, right? Because they had it wrong. And also, anyone in the future who has a different opinion than us, because things tend to change in society, they're all barbarians too. It's only now, right now, in this year, that we know absolute morality. And anyone before us, and anyone after us, and anyone in any culture that disagrees with us are barbarians and fools, right? But this is sort of, C.S. Lewis called this chronological snobbery, that everyone before us was just, fools, right? And we now are possessed of the perfect intellect that we understand morality, right? C.S. Lewis, again, chronological snobbery. But that really is the only conclusion. If you think absolute morality exists and you know it, and there is no God, that's what you're saying. That I know morality, this time, this place, anyone before me, anyone after, in any country, in any planet, they're all wrong. And I know it. I mean, this is like the height of arrogance, is it not? Right? So I think we can perhaps hopefully see that the idea that absolute morality does exist, needing to shoehorn it into sort of this naturalist process of the universe just spewing forth morals when the Big Bang occurred is crazy. It's just as crazy as my, computer in my basement producing absolute morality in a game. And again, just as a, little twist on it, can you imagine? So, there is such a game, as Grand Theft Auto, right? In Grand Theft Auto, you steal cars, I guess by the name. And so in this world, stealing is essentially encouraged, But now if we were to say, to this world, well, stealing is wrong, or they would say to us, stealing is right. I mean, if let's just say actually it wasn't an accident game, I made the game, and they say to me, we've collectively decided that stealing is wrong. I will say, no, I'm the creator. I made it so that it's right. You can't tell me if it's right or wrong. I made it. I made the rules. Right. And so perhaps we're sort of seeing this kind of thing creep in here where we need sort of a designer to tell us how the rules were constructed. There is no naturalist way to determine what the rules are. And this is going to come up in class 4 when we look at sort of what the purpose of the Bible is. But there are some things we learned in Gödel's incompleteness theorem. There's some things we cannot determine by looking around the universe. And I would say morals are one of them. Just by looking at the physical universe, we cannot determine morality. And this is where sort of this person, sort of their argument fails, because they believe it exists and have to explain it naturalistically and can't. Any questions about that? Good.
What did C.S. Lewis say about morals? He said something around similar to what you're saying here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so one thing he said was like, if you look at the development of societies around the world, they all tend to believe the same things are good, right? In the general sense, right? Everyone believes that love is good, truthfulness is a virtue,
Murder's bad.
Murder's bad, right? Like now, not that all the societies are perfectly emblematic of these things, but no country admires the murderer, the liar, the thief, right? They're all supposedly sort of punished. So what he said was, well, how can that be? All these cultures, sort of, if they were naturalistically emerging all around the world, that's weird. Actually, we should suspect that we would find very different cultural organizations around how their morals develop, and we don't. So he said, sort of anthropologically, sociologically, this is very strange if you try to explain this naturalistically. So that's one thing. Yeah, C.S. Lewis said. Okay, let's flip it now. I'm thinking of the other person, the naturalist, the person who says, well, sure, if absolute morality does exist, then there's a God, but it doesn't exist anyway, so who cares? So, to this person, the natural world is all there is. So everything has to be sort of explained, sort of how it emerged naturally. But now let's think about this then. Okay, so there's no absolute morality. It's all just cultural convention, right? Societies have developed laws that just work for the society. And it's not morals, it's just, what's useful. Okay. So if I go to international waters, there are no laws, right? I bring my family and a storm hits and we're stranded. I can eat my kids, right? My cute little, 5-year-old daughter, my 2-year-old son, I can eat them. Survival of the fittest. I need to eat them. I need the strength to get back to shore, right? Well, there's nothing wrong with that, right? No one should have a problem with that. Except everyone has a problem with that, right? Even in that situation, somehow people would think that's wrong, even though it's necessary to survive. And there's actually sort of a worse example yet. Richard Dawkins. So again, let's remember back to the World War II, right? The Nazis were performing horrible experiments on the Jews and others in the concentration camps in the name of eugenics, right? The perfection of the human genome. Okay. Richard Dawkins has said eugenics works, but heaven forbid we should do it. Okay, so first of all, what's he appealing to? Heaven, okay? Because there's no naturalist explanation of why you shouldn't do it. Second of all, if we're all just a random smash of atoms, and we don't really mean much, right? Why should we perfect the human race, right? We can make sure that our descendants are better off than us, and that the human race will be strengthened into the future to face whatever challenges it needs to, okay? Because it works. Richard Dawkins says it works, but heaven forbid we should do it. Well, why, right? If there is no absolute morality, we should do eugenics. So we provide the best chance of our species propagating and continuing into the future. But this is the thing. Again, C.S. Lewis called this worldview unlivable, right? That to go around saying there's no morals, but yet to say, well, yes, but we can't do eugenics. That's bad. That's a contradiction. You cannot live that way. When I was attending, I used to live in Vancouver, I attended Broadway Church, and the pastor one time was talking about this kind of stuff, and he said, if this is true, the only rational person in our world is the sociopath, because they do whatever they want. And that's reality then, right? There is no moral. There's nothing guiding us. You should do whatever you want. Whatever's the best for you, you should do it. So we're all deceiving ourselves, right? If that were true. But again, it's unlivable. And so people have said that when they talk to Richard Dawkins in private, he'll kind of admit, like, I guess, murder is wrong. Okay. But, sorry. He'll say, murder is okay. Sorry, right? Because he has to say it's okay, because he doesn't believe in any guiding absolute morality that would say it's wrong. So according to the naturalist worldview, murder is okay. Eugenics is awesome. But he can't say that in public because no one would agree, right? His book sales would plummet, okay? So again, C.S. Lewis says it's unlivable. The naturalist worldview, when it comes to morality, is unlivable. And if it were true, then we should all be very much in favor of eugenics and get rid of all of our, genetic faults and make the perfect human race ready to, tackle climate change and aliens and who knows what else is coming, okay? So again, the naturalist worldview falls apart. So whether you look at it sort of, believing this one and try to counter this one or vice versa, we inexorably come to this need for some designer creating absolute morality that is apart from the natural world. Any questions about that one? Good. All right, well, that's so we've gone over the sort of 5 of the 10 arguments of the existence of God we're going to do in this class. So that's the 5 ways of Aquinas, Kalam cosmological argument, the nature of forces, fine-tuning argument for morality. So next class we'll do the next 5. And so I hope this isn't, too much information kind of all, slamming into you all at once. But again, I think the important part of this is that we have so many reasons to believe in God. And they're from basically any way we look at it, we come to the conclusion, right? So we look at, again, science or math or, philosophy or morality. Every single time it leads us to God, which again is what we should expect. If we really believe that God made the whole universe, right, and morality and everything, we should expect that an analysis of it would lead us to God. So I think, yeah, with that one, then we'll finish here and again do the next half the week next week. So when I pray, and we can finish then. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you, Lord, so much for this class and for everyone who was able to attend. And I thank you, God, that as we examine our universe, Lord, we come to find you. And I just thank you for that wonderful gift, God. Again, as we read in Romans, Lord, that since the beginning, your invisible qualities, your eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen from what has been made. I just thank you that when we analyze our world, we come to understand you. But I thank you also that you didn't leave us there and you gave us your word, you gave us your Son to give us not just a general understanding of God, but a personal relationship with God and the forgiveness of sins through your Son, Jesus Christ. So I just thank you for every person here. I pray that this information would strengthen their faith, strengthen their witness to others. I just pray that you could bless this class as we continue and the weeks to come. So thank you, Lord, we pray in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, thank you guys so much. If you have any questions, please, feel free to let me know anytime. And then otherwise, yeah, we'll do the latter half of the arguments next week. You're welcome.
Oh, yeah. Did you want to? Ryan, my right brain.
Okay.
It's so